Welcome to the Literary Translation Centre. Thank you all for coming, amid all the other delights on offer at the London Book Fair. This event is being presented by English Pen with the assistance of Transcript and Words Without Borders, and we're really grateful to be collaborating with those organisations who are working exactly in the remit that we're going to talk about, which is translating culture in times of conflict. And I know all the panel members have something to say about all of the very ambiguous and important words that make up the title of the panel. So we're going to move on to what they have to say as fast as possible. I'm Sophie Mayer, and I work with English Pen, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this session. I initially started working with Pen on the Pen Atlas, which was launched at the London Book Fair in 2008 and has since undergone an amazing regeneration under Tasia Dorkofikis and is now bringing the best of world literature to you every Thursday, and is also looking to hear from you. So Tasia is always open to pitches, and you can get in touch with her via the website. We are, in fact, bringing you tomorrow's news today with a special preview of the piece that will be published tomorrow, which is called Translation, Revolution and Pedagogy, Working Together on Translating Egypt's Revolution, the Language of Tahrir, which is by Samia Mehrez, one of our panelists, and you can come and get your exclusive copy at the end of the event. And I think Samia will be telling us a bit about that project as well. Pen's Atlas is part of its wider remit, engaging in the freedom to read and the freedom to write. And in particular, for this panel and this space, how that happens through translation and some of the barriers around it, and why translation is so important to those freedoms. And what we'll be looking at today is how in conflict situations, both an urgency surrounding the need to communicate, and that's both a pragmatic urgency, as language changes meanings very fast, as people find themselves in border zones, as refugees, working to translate their culture, their nation, their ideas for outsiders, for the media. And also the urgency sort of from the other side, that as the world's media turns its attention, audiences around the world become focused, interested, and perhaps realize that the information they're receiving is incomplete. And some of the competing commercial and cultural pressures that then fall onto the translator. Which image do you serve in order to get the information, the communication out there, and in order to serve the dual community between which those translations are passing? And I'm really only here to open this up and to have the great honour of introducing you to our panellists, who will each be speaking for 5 minutes. Then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves, but I think the real focus is on opening the discussion up to you. So please don't be shy about asking questions. We're all excited to get into a real conversation and to translate from this side to that side. Oh, thank you. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. And just to start by saying that Sabrina Mahfouz was supposed to be on the panel. Unfortunately, she has a family emergency and isn't able to attend, but she sends her greetings to everyone. And we're very fortunate to have Dan Gorman, instead. He's the director of Firefly International, which I'm sure many of you have come across, even if you don't know, because it organizes many arts and education projects across the world in conflict zones, including the UK. And for the past 4 years, that's been predominantly visible in the Real festivals, which Dan established. Real Iraq, which happened in March? In March. Some of you probably went to some of the films or other cultural events that they brought to London. And he's been involved both in the UK and internationally with culture as a tool for dialogue, both between artists and audiences. Also joining us on the panel, we have Robin Yassin Kassab, who is the author of The Road from Damascus. And Amer Hussein, writing in The Independent, described this novel as a very original book that deconstructs rather than celebrates multiculturalism and assimilation. Written with an insider's anger and pain, it's also a double-edged narrative that sails with bold energy between its Arab, Islamic, and British references. So no pressure, Robin. He co-edits The Critical Muslim, a quarterly magazine which looks like a book, and also blogs at kumfuz.com. So he's celebrating the literary digital amalgam. And he reviews for The Guardian and other British and international publications. And rounding out the panel, we have Samia, who is the author of tomorrow's PEN Atlas piece, but she's also the professor of Arabic literature and director of the Center for Translation Studies at the American University in Cairo. And many of you will probably have come across one of her books. She is published widely on critical theory, post-colonial literature, as well as individual studies of important Egyptian writers such as Naguib Mahfouz. And a very important book on Egypt's culture wars. She's also edited wonderful anthologies of Cairo writing. She's the editor of Translating Egypt's Revolution, the Language of Tahrir, which I think she's going to talk about today, and is also working on two other connected projects, a translation into English of Mona Prince's memoir Ismi Thawra. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Thawra. Revolution is My Name, which is forthcoming this year, and a book-length manuscript which is tentatively titled The Making of Revolutionary Culture in Egypt. So with those delights ahead, I'm going to take a back seat and hand over first of all to Dan.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Hold on, I'll move this slightly closer.
Yep.
It's very good to be here. Thank you very much to Literature Across Frontiers and to PEN for the early morning phone call this morning. I'm a poor replacement for Sabrina Mahfouz, but I'll tell you a little bit about the work we've done through Real Festivals. I thought I'd start by doing that and then maybe open it up to a few more general points. Real Festivals works under the umbrella of an NGO called Firefly International, which focuses on crossing boundaries through friendship, education, and the arts. And within that, Real Festivals was established based on the back of a trip which I made with Firefly International to Afghanistan in 2007. And I went to Afghanistan under the premise of making a film with some colleagues from another organization. And whilst I was there, was overwhelmed and deeply, deeply impressed with the quality of arts that was happening in Afghanistan, and also the fact that arts were happening at this time of conflict. And therefore, on my return to the UK, one of the first questions I was asked, or the question that I was always asked was, it must have been very dangerous, you must have been very scared. And at the same time, actually, I'd had this incredible experience, and we thought that it was worthwhile trying to share some of that and use the arts as a way to try and challenge some of the preconceptions and the lazy stereotypes that are made about areas in conflict. So I suppose you could argue that in some ways we almost instrumentalize the arts as a way to try and challenge stereotypes and challenge preconceptions. And I think that's maybe something which could be interesting to discuss. So the first festival that we did was Real Afghanistan, and that took place in 2008, and just took place in Edinburgh. And I suppose the name Real, you might wonder, why is Real Festivals? We have a strong focus on poetry and music. Initially, the project was supposed to just be a film festival. It was supposed to be quite a small, quite a simple project. And we were going to host some Afghan films in Edinburgh. The project kept growing. There was quite a lot of interest in doing it. And so therefore, we got a little bit more support, and we managed to bring over some musicians from Afghanistan as well, thus adding a second strand. So it was film and music. And then one of the filmmakers we brought over was an Afghan author called Atiq Rahimi. And so Atiq Rahimi did a couple of readings in a bookshop called Word Power in Edinburgh. And so therefore, we essentially evolved into these three strands. And what was initially just going to be a single project, we had very, very good feedback to it. So we decided to keep going with the project. There was a clear aim in our mind to try and highlight, I suppose, UK involvement in the conflict in Afghanistan, and look at bypassing the governmental institutions and just working on direct interaction between people. So we decided in our debrief to try and follow up with another area which was quite close to our heart, and that was Iraq. So in 2009, we did our first Real Iraq, although we recently did another more major festival on Iraq, again taking place just in Edinburgh. And by this time we had our three main strands, which were film, music, and poetry. And we hosted people like Sinan Antoun, the Iraqi poet and translator, and academic who writes for Jadaliya. And through this, we decided, we felt that we were getting somewhere and that there was this direct interaction was really important to try and build. And the background to all of this is trying to challenge these preconceptions and stereotypes and trying to almost humanize areas in conflict, because very often you can see within mainstream media there's almost a dehumanizing of this area, and it becomes a very black and white image of a place. So we wanted to try and introduce and try and highlight the diversity and pluralism that exists, I mean, around the world, but all too often it's not shown with areas in conflict. So then we moved on, and we decided one aim had always been to try and do reciprocal events, and we hadn't had the capacity or the know-how really to try to do reciprocal events at that stage. So in 2010 we started working on a project which was going to take place in 2011. And that aim was not to focus on an area in overt conflict at that stage, but to work in somewhere, again, with a focus on challenging stereotypes and moving past preconceptions. And so we focused on doing a three-way project between Syria, Lebanon, and the UK. And we started working on this in 2010. And then in March 2011, the aim was to host the events in May 2011. So in March 2011, the situation changed significantly. And all the way through this process, because we were working in quite a controlled, restrictive environment under the Syrian regime, which I know Robin will talk more about, we had a number of advisors within Syria who essentially were human rights activists and also artists at the same time. So who could see in some ways both sides of the coin. How far do you go in terms of engagement? What compromises do you make in order to host events in a place? So the festival didn't happen in Syria. We decided at the last minute, well, in late March, based on the advice of our panel in Syria, not to host events there. And so instead we hosted, but we decided we were very clear that it was very important to go ahead with events and go ahead with getting Syrian voices out on a national stage which weren't being represented. So we hosted events in Lebanon and in the UK, and as part of these we also hosted a poetry translation project which featured Syrian poets Jolan Haji and Rasha Amran, and then poets based in Lebanon, Mazen Marouf and Yahya Jaber. And it was extremely successful. It was extremely successful on a number of levels. One was that there was the 4 Arabic-speaking poets working with 4 English-speaking poets who came from Scotland. And the success of the project in some ways was building these long-term interactions between these poets. So the poets in Scotland returned to Scotland and have continued to work and continued to communicate with these poets. Also in terms of giving a stage and giving access to these voices, which are often the first things to be lost in a time of conflict, in a time of reduction of identity, and when the Syria is seen as just Syria and Syrian culture. And I think this is something maybe we should discuss as well, this idea of national culture and how do we challenge that by using the arts and by trying to promote a diversity of opinion and pluralism. We then went on in 2012 to do another Syria event in the UK, and in 2013, most recently, we hosted the Real Iraq project. And for this, again, we did some reciprocal events. The Real Iraq events took place across the UK in 9 different cities at the same time. But prior to that, in January, we took part in the Erbil Literature Festival in Iraqi Kurdistan. And it's very nice to see Gharib Iskandar here, who is one of the Iraqi poets who took part in the project. And so within that, we brought, again, 4 Scottish-based poets together with 4 Iraqi-based poets to work on new translations of each other's work. Now, whether these are actually translations or essentially they were versions. And so the reason we use the technique versions as in each poet, there's quite a lot of change between the original source poem and the end result. And we had made a conscious decision to do that, in that for us, and to try and build this empathy and overlap and it was important for the people taking part to feel ownership of the work. And so through this, because both poets, the original poet, the author of the work, is working together with the new author of the work, with a bridge translation in between, everybody is happy with the end result, because there's essentially a sign-off from the original author and the end result. But at the same time, you get a kind of ownership of this. So the poet who's worked on their new version can then present that work as both their work and the work of the original poet. And we find it a very successful way of trying to translate culture. I'm not sure how much longer I've got. Done? That's it.
Thank you. I think we should move on and give people everything to think about.
Hello. 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 Thank you. Audience participation, that's good. So first I was asked to talk about what I'm doing now, just as Dan has talked about what he's doing now. Well, I've been trying to write a second novel for a very long time, and it keeps going wrong. It needs yet another version, so I've temporarily given it up, and I'm writing very fast a first draft of a novel set in Syria at the moment, through the revolution. That's what I'm doing. And of course, writing something like that in English, probably mainly with an English-speaking audience in mind, is metaphorically a great act of translation. You're translating a place, a culture, a situation, a language, into a new language, into a new context. You're putting it through a filter. I suppose even if you were writing about events in London in English, it's still metaphorically an act of translation. It's going through your mind into your words, and it becomes something a bit different. Fortunately, I've only got 5 minutes, so I don't have to say anything more about that, because I haven't thought those metaphors through at all. So moving rapidly on, I'll talk about 3 Syrian books which have been translated into English recently in the last year and a half. One is by Nihad Seris, and it's called The Silence and the Roar. It was written years before the revolution, and it's a kind of dystopian vision, a kind of tragicomic vision of life in a repressive society. It's not, Syria is not named, the dictator is not named. It looks quite a lot like Syria, but it could be other places as well. It's a deliberately surreal vision of the kind of sadly surreal state of dictatorship. It's translated by Max Weiss. It's one of the 2 books of the 3 I'm going to talk about who are translated by Max Weiss. All of these books are translated really, really well. I think it's very positive that there now seems to be a kind of stable of young translators translating from Arabic to English who are really good. So that's something very positive. I think translation skills are improving. The second book is by Khalid Khalifa, and it's called In Praise of Hatred. I think it won the prize it did win the prize that they refer to as the Arab Booker. It was shortlisted, didn't win. Okay. It's really good. If you buy one of the 3 books I'm going to talk about, I would recommend that you buy Khalid Khalifa's book In Praise of Hatred, which is set in the 1980s. It's set in Aleppo in the 1980s. Of course, in 1982 there was a terrible massacre in the city of Hama in Syria when the Muslim Brotherhood had taken over. They committed their own crimes, and then the regime went in there and flattened the historical center of Hama and murdered somewhere between 10 and 40,000 civilians. It's set in that period of time, and it's equally critical of intolerance on all sides, the kind of secular minority intolerance of the regime and the Islamist Sunni intolerance of the opposition at the time. So in terms of its critique of intolerance and hatred and inability to see other people's point of view, I suppose it's relevant to now, although what is happening now is really very different from what happened in the 1980s. This is much more of a genuine popular revolution, and although underneath, as a result of all the trauma and the regime's instrumentalization of sect, there are now elements of it which which do look like civil war. It started as a popular revolution, and it still is a popular revolution. That's translated by Laurie Price. Again, it's an excellent translation. Finally, Samer Yazbek's book, Woman in the Crossfire. Samer Yazbek is a journalist and a novelist, and she works in TV and so on. I believe that her novel Cinnamon is about to be published in English. It has been, or has just been published in English. But Woman in the Crossfire was translated again by Max Weiss. It's an excellent translation. It's not a novel, it's a diary. Its subtitle is Diaries of the Syrian Revolution. She's interesting. It's sad that we have to talk about people's sectarian affiliation, but I think we do have to because of the way in which it's being instrumentalized politically at the moment. She's an Alawi. She's from the same sect as the president is, or the gangster-in-chief. And it's interesting to read from her point of view, in her voice, how she is very unhappy about how the regime has played on these weaknesses, these divisions in the society to divide and rule. And she herself has been ostracized by members of her own community, and she's been slandered. All kinds of horrible lies have been told about her by the regime in her community because of her opposition. Now I'll talk about bad translation. There's a journalist called Robert Fisk, who you'll all have heard of, who years ago was a really good journalist and did some great work, wrote a good book about Lebanon, can write very well. Recently, I don't know, maybe he's just got old. I don't want to make excuses for him because it's really upsetting how he's behaving. But just literally first, to talk about literal bad translation. The slogan of the Ba'ath Party is Ummi Arabiya Wahde Zat Risala Khalide. The first part of that, Ummi Arabiya Wahde, means one Arab nation. And Robert Fisk, who pretends to speak Arabic, which is rather sinister, Robert Fisk translates it repeatedly, again and again and again. He translates this in his journalism as mother of the Arab nation. He thinks that the slogan is saying that Syria is the mother of the Arab nation. Now here he's mixing up the word mother with the word ummah, which means nation or community. And it just shows the kind of laziness that not just that he keeps making this mistake, but that his editors at The Independent keep letting it slip. It just again and again and again, this very basic mistake which he keeps on making. And I just find it worrying that the man pretends or kind of sells himself as the only correspondent who can speak Arabic. And he obviously can't. He probably can order a drink in Arabic and say please and thank you. Why does he pretend when he can't? And then this leads on to the next level, which is the more general metaphorical mistranslation. Fisk wrote wonderful articles earlier in his career about the evils of embedded journalism, about journalists embedding themselves with militaries, and going around and getting very skewed, partial versions of the truth because they're there with occupying soldiers. And then he's just done exactly the same thing. He's written a lot of disgusting pieces which really tell the opposite of what's going on in Syria. But the most disgusting piece was when he went into a suburb of Damascus called Daraya, where there'd just been a horrific massacre, and he went in standing with the soldiers who had committed the massacre and interviewed the survivors, and obviously gave us a very skewed version of the truth. That's an example. I mean, I could rant and rave all day about bad journalism on Syria, bad presentations of what's going on, based on people's prior ideological assumptions, not based on looking at what's actually happening in Syria, but based on their previous assumptions about how they think things work in the Middle East. One more minute. On the other hand, much more positively, the Syrian people, in all their variety and pluralism and not speaking with one voice, speaking with many voices, are now speaking for themselves, and not only in Arabic, in all kinds, in all languages. There's lots of citizen journalism that goes right from the YouTube videos, the films that people have made on their mobile phones, which have been uploaded, which we've all seen, all the way to newspapers in the same place that I mentioned earlier, the suburb of Damascus called Daraya. There is now a local newspaper. Most of the civilians have left Daraya because it's a terrible war zone. It's been under siege for months. But those who are still there are producing a newspaper. And lots of areas of Syria are now producing their own independent news, which is a fantastic movement. It's a cultural change which is not going to go away. So even if in the future we get Islamists, for example, becoming the next regime, it's not going to be the case that the Islamists will just come and stick and everyone will obey them, because now everybody's mouths are opened and everybody is questioning all kinds of authority. Finally, I'll mention the village of Kafr Anbel, which you will have seen on the news, whether you know the name or not, because there's obviously somebody in Kafr Anbel speaks excellent English and is very well read, and they have some very funny often and very clever English language slogans which they hold up at the Friday demonstrations. The last Friday, the slogan said, "King Kim Jong-un, your attempt to draw the world's attention away from Assad's crimes is childish. You will be spanked for that." So using English to communicate with the outside world, referring to things that are happening in other parts of the world in a very clever, humorous way. The same people in Kafr Anbel have changed Shakespeare quotes slightly to make comments on what's happening in Syria and the indifference of the world outside. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Or is it afternoon already? When asked to come and do this presentation, actually, I didn't quite know what I would want to talk about. And I had to think, first and foremost, why I have been involved in 2 consecutive projects of translation over the past 2 years, which is the lifetime of Egypt's uprising. Why it was that I accelerated or intensified my work in this particular area, which is translation. And I came to understand, actually, as I was thinking about this, that translation has come to represent, not just for me, but for the students that I worked with on the project that Sophie has mentioned, was a form of therapy. And so today, rather than speak about, this sort of extrovert aspect of translation, the translator, I want to focus on the self of the translator. It's a rather sort of introverted vision. So let me just begin by speaking to get a bit about the context in which we find ourselves in Egypt. Obviously, everybody knows that it's been 2 years since the beginning of the January uprising that continues to remap in many complex ways the future of Egypt, as well as its position in both the region and the world. This is to say that the Egyptian uprising itself, with its ongoing proliferation of narratives, and they have been contradictory throughout, resists and defies unified or unitary meaning and closure. From Thawra, revolution, to Fawra, with an F, Fawra, uprising, to Inqilab, coup, not to mention global translations of this uprising during the Occupy movements in hundreds of cities around the world that arguably were inspired by what was happening in Egypt and in Tahrir. The very naming and framing of Egypt's revolution attests to the complexity of its meanings and significations. Indeed, as a multi-layered text, revolution, not just in Egypt, but in many countries of the region, is not to be read as a string of meaning or a single linear line of signification, but rather as layers of narratives and layers of narrative fields that are at once open and dynamic. It is precisely this thickness, and I want to speak of it in terms of thickness, incompleteness, and undeterminedness of the text of the revolution that accounts for its contradictory and unsettling moments that we continue to inhabit and live. There have been and continue to be moments of uplifting euphoria. I mean, we've been on this roller coaster throughout the past 2 years. Uplifting euphoria, innocence, and even naivete. Anyone who has been to Tahrir or watched Tahrir or other occasions of demonstration, protest in Egypt over the past 2 years will have no doubt noted the festive, creative, uplifting ambiance that combines revolutionary edge with scathing political humor. But on the other hand, of course, the uprising has had and continues to have its moments of tragedy and violence that lead to anxiety, fear, and apprehension of what the end of the revolutionary text might be. Indeed, the repeated spectacles of violence, intimidation, harassment, and sheer horror that are lived and relived on social media, private satellite channels, but more importantly now, in public squares where these spectacles of violence are actually screened to audiences nationwide. All of these spectacles of violence point to a kind of opaqueness, inaccessibility, perhaps even untranslatability of this revolutionary moment. In English, as well as in other European languages, the word translation, as you know, has more than one derivation, all basically connoting the fluid notion of carrying across or leading across. This act of carrying across obviously implicates the actor, the carrier, in other words, the translator. So you're not just giving something to someone, you're implicated in it as you do it yourself. Similarly, in Arabic, the word translation, tarjama, is equally ambiguous and fluid. Tarjama concurrently means to translate from one language to the other, to interpret or expound the words of an other, but also to write the other, as in biography. The word for biography in Arabic is tarjama. And to write oneself, as in autobiography, tarjama dhatiya. Okay, so it's still the same word. In both English and Arabic, therefore, translation and tarjama seem to be acts of interpretation in which the self, as interpreter, is heavily implicated, not just in interpreting the other, but also in interpreting the self, right? And I think that is very important. So what does the translator do in the thick of revolution? What does she or he carry across during such an unstable moment of signification, right? Of course, as my colleagues have spoken, the translator is tasked on certain levels with sort of giving voice to the unvoiced or the silenced, becoming an agent of change, being in solidarity with the dispossessed, becoming a bridge between cultures, going across borders and boundaries. All of these are tasks of the translator. But what about the self of the translator, herself, right? That is thoroughly implicated in this act of carrying across. And suddenly one needs to also ask the question, because it seems very innocent, you just translate in moments of conflict, but actually, what is it that really motivates you to translate? Where is this act coming from? Why do you want to do it? And what does it say something about that other that you are translating? Or is it perhaps does it say more about you as the translator? And once you begin to reflect about that, on this, how does the act of translation, therefore, impact identity, the identity of the translator? How is the notion of identity unsettled in moments of crisis and in moments of fluid signification, in moments that I have also referred to as perhaps untranslatable? And so all of these thoughts actually came to me after I submitted the piece that I submitted to Pen Atlas that will be released tomorrow, and seems like a very finished, confident piece, right, about a project that I undertook with graduate students at AUC. This is the book that finally, this is the end product. We were asked in the aftermath of the uprising, actually on the very next day of when Mubarak stepped down, we went back to school and had to improvise new seminars to be able to engage the community and the students in what was happening on the ground, considering also that all of us were involved in Tahrir and were suddenly being taken back to the classroom. So I decided to teach a seminar that was called Translating Revolution. And it began on the 12th of February, that is one day after Mubarak stepped down. What was fascinating about this experience was that the seminar attracted both Arabic-speaking but also non-Arabic-speaking students who actually had no Arabic and who found themselves caught up in this moment of literal untranslatability. I mean, there was a graduate students from the UK, I had a student from Japan, I had a student from America, and the three of them really, you know, one of them had no Arabic at all. And they were caught, therefore, in the midst of this untranslatable moment with a tremendous desire to translate it, first to themselves, but to themselves first, but also to others. And it was very important, therefore, that it was very interesting that the seminar became a magnet to people who needed this kind of therapy, right? Translating revolution became therapy for everybody. And it was interesting also how the seminar pedagogically was constructed. They worked together because in this moment of untranslatability and fluidity, it's also a very lonely moment, you know, where you feel completely cut off, and therefore they worked together as you would, you know, in a therapy session, and they also had a blog as a sort of rehearsal of their translations. And the work that finally emerged in the book came through 3 months of confronting the untranslatability, trying to understand it, coming to terms with it, finally collectively articulating it, you know, in a language, and ultimately sort of finding meaning in what was surrounding us. And I think the exercise was precise. What lay at the heart of all of this was this whole notion of trying to find meaning, to translate what was happening on the ground, first and foremost, for ourselves, to ourselves, and then, ultimately to others. Thank you.
I'd like you to join me in thanking all of our panelists. As Samia said, sometimes you think your thoughts are finished and then you have new thoughts which come chasing up on them just from the very act of having phrased your thoughts. And I'm sure that questions from the audience will be an opportunity for our panelists to expand, to add new notions that they've heard from sharing each other. And I'm going to give you a moment to gather your thoughts and start the panel off with one question. And then I'm going to turn it over to the floor. So you don't have to wait very long now. And my question is really taking or fusing ideas from all three panelists. So Dan's description of the workshop at Erbil, where the translator poets and poet translators work together through a medium language translation, and as he said, both signed off on the independent but connected texts at the end. And then through what Robin was saying about the impact that mistranslation can have on an actual conflict situation. So Fiske's mistranslations are actually irresponsible in that they can have a return impact. But that what the people are doing when they're writing banners in English or making YouTube videos is producing their own translation, intervening into that media. And then Samia's idea of translation as therapy is to say, well, does translation, whether we think of it in the narrow sense of literary translation or the broader sense of cultural translation, actually offer us a model for conflict resolution? That actually the act that translators undertake with writers, that writers undertake with translators, could be compared to some of the anxieties and difficulties that boil over into larger conflicts, and that the resolution of these to produce a translated work within the translator herself as well could be a useful model for conflict resolution. Just to start you with a really easy question.
Who would you like to go first?
Samia, you look like you have something to say?
Well, yeah, sure. I'll go back to that because that's an interesting thought. You know, that I speak about translation and as therapy, and you turn around and say, you know, could we then use that model in order to speak about conflict resolution? I think you're absolutely right, because I did address the fact that, you know, the translation as therapy actually unsettles your own identity. It gets you out of your own boundaries, and it makes you reflect on your positionality and your motivation. And once you do that, you engage translation from a very different position that will definitely lead to a kind of conversation, a closeness, an attempt to resolve conflict within you, but also within that other that you are addressing. And you will be doing so from that newly acquired awareness and consciousness. So definitely, this sort of reflection on what one does and why one does it is bound to help us work towards, you know, minimizing mistranslation.
Hello. I don't know which part of your question this relates to. I can't really remember the question, but while you were talking, I wrote down context, decontextualization. Hello. And why did I write that down? I really don't know. I'm not a translator in a literal sense, but so it's a question for the translators here. But I suppose that must be a difficult thing for you to think about: is how much context do you put in? I mean, if a character says Allahu Akbar, do you have to add in a paragraph to say this is something that Muslims say and it means this and it could mean this, but in this obviously you don't. But you have that problem of how do you get a context across in which utterances or acts have meaning? And so when for example, I was praising Khalid Khalifa's novel In Praise of Hatred, I was asked by Doubleday to write the introduction to the English translation. And they said, we want you to write a translation because it's a novel which needs some context for the non-Arab or non-Syrian reader. So it's obvious in that case they want some political context, some historical context, a bit of cultural context, but then everything needs a bit of context, which leads me back to what I was saying about bad translation in journalism. For example, if you know, it's no good just reporting that the people of this town have had a demonstration in which they're expressing their anger and hatred for a nearby Shia village. It's no good just saying that if you don't explain that a lot of the people in the nearby Shia village have sent their sons into the Shabiha, the pro-Assad militia, which has committed crimes against people in this town. It doesn't justify the sectarianism of the first statement, but it puts it in a context. It shows where it's coming from. A lot of people are just coming out with one side which is just like showing us some angry Palestinians saying they want to destroy Israel without putting it into any context. Why are they angry? Are they able to destroy Israel, etc.? Or another example, if we find that in a few cases some actually no weapons have come from the United States. If we find that in a few cases some light weapons have got to the resistance in Syria with the approval of the United States, some people translating this through their prior ideological assumptions will say, therefore, obviously, this means that the whole revolution is an American plot against the glorious resistance regime. And they're missing the story, because the main story is that overall America's been doing everything that it can do up until about now. Maybe it's changing now, to stop effective weaponry getting to the resistance. And the European Union has been embargoing weapons going to Syria, a bit like the Bosnian Muslims were left alone to be slaughtered by the already armed Serbs in the 80s. So by miscontextualizing or failing to contextualize, or by relying on your previous political assumptions without looking at this fresh situation and recontextualizing, you arrive at something which obscures truth rather than carrying over truth.
Just briefly to continue on that, I very much agree with you in terms of context, and it's vital to provide this wider context. Looking at the idea of translation as conflict resolution, occasionally when I'm using lazy shorthand to talk about what we do, I say that we're an arts and dialogue organization. And dialogue is also, it's a very contested term, in terms of the dialogue between who and who. And the main reason for this, and what we try and bear in mind very deeply, is the power imbalances that exist around the world. And how do we incorporate that into our work? We try and bring people directly together to overcome these power imbalances, and yet they impact on our work all the time. A very clear example of this was the work that we did in Iraq. We brought 4 poets from the UK to work with 4 Iraqi poets, and we did these workshops in just near Erbil. However, the return leg of this, the aim was to bring the same 4 poets from Iraq to work with the 4 poets in the UK, again working on further translations, but one of them was declined their visa by the UK government. So therefore they couldn't take part in this work, and it's very important to recognize that these power imbalances exist. Translation can provide, I would say, an aspect of conflict resolution, but it can only do so when taking into account these imbalances, and how do we contextualize these imbalances and make it quite clear that these exist, and use translation and dialogue as a tool for challenging them.
Thank you to all our panelists again, and thank you to Dan for reminding us about the pragmatics of translation for authors and translators, and the way in which translation is not just a neutral term. Translating between a border guard and someone who's been stopped at the border is not the same act of translation as translating a literary text. And I think we would welcome your questions about the pragmatic aspects of translation, from its economics to its word-level practicalities, as well as about the political and philosophical and psychological topics that we've been discussing. So with that, I'm going to initiate a dialogue, not uncomplicatedly. Would anyone like to ask the first question? Or pretend the first question's been asked and ask the second question, because sometimes that's easier. Or do any of the panel members have questions for each? Oh, no, great.
My question is for all of you, but particularly picking up on what you were saying, Samia, about untranslatability. I'm wondering, in your different experiences, how you found untranslatable things, perhaps leaning towards a particular maybe art form, or a particular literary form. Sorry, I'm being really inarticulate here, translating what's coming from my head, but if there's a particular form that seems to be the one that pulls something that is untranslatable. Does that make sense?
Do you want to go first, because it was...
Is that working?
Yeah.
Thanks, Robin.
I'll go back to this book because it was an interesting experiment. It's still not working? It was working. Okay,
Oh, yeah,
now. one of the chapters is on translating humor, right? And I think one of the most complicated areas of translation during the uprising has been humor. We're bombarded with it daily. I don't stop laughing all day, despite of the horror that surrounds us. And it, and interestingly, the chapter was co-authored by an Egyptian and a Japanese student who, just for the life of him, couldn't understand why we cracked up laughing all the time. And he had to work on this chapter, right? And make sense of why Egyptians were laughing. And it was a very interesting experiment for us and for him, because suddenly, you know, we discussed, he said, in Japan we don't have jokes, right? I said, what? For an Egyptian, that seems terribly bizarre that you can have a culture that is jokeless, right? But actually, jokes are only dramatized. They are performed on the stage. People do not tell each other jokes, right? So he found it very strange that people popped these three-liners and would, you know, crack up for the rest of the day. And so he had to rethink, you know, why it is that humor was untranslatable. You know, who is being addressed? What are the sort of basic musts for humor to work? How does humor work? What are the requirements of humor that ultimately lead to laughter? So I think that particular area, humor in particular, is untranslatable. Even when you think of somebody like Bassem Youssef, who has made, you know, who has become an international name, all the coverage about Bassem has likened him, and I think unnecessarily, right, to Jon Stewart, to make him translatable, right? Because his humor and most of what he is saying is stuff that remains untranslatable. Right? So the only way to make him translatable is to mistranslate him, I would argue, and say that, you know, Bassem Youssef equals Jon Stewart. Now we've translated him for you. You see.
I'll make a general comment after making a specific one. I'll go back to the example which I mentioned earlier, Allahu Akbar. How do you translate Allahu Akbar? You know, especially nowadays, more so than at the beginning, especially nowadays, you hear that constantly. You watch a YouTube video of a battle or a demonstration in Syria, and there's a constant background of people shouting Takbir, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. So what does it mean? You know, I suppose for a Western audience conditioned by Orientalism, that's the Muslim war cry. It's what Muslims on horses with their scimitar shout. Of course, at the beginning of until now, because mosques are one place where people gather. Before the revolution, the mosque and the church were the only places where people were permitted legally to gather in Syria. So Christians and Druze and atheists and so on would go to the mosques in order to express themselves politically. And the Christians and the atheists, as well as the Muslims, would all be chanting Allahu Akbar afterwards. So it's obviously a bit more complex than the Muslim war cry. And sometimes we read it as a call for Sharia law or a call for exterminating the minorities or something, and probably for one or two people in the crowds, it does mean something like that. Allahu Akbar is usually translated into English as God is greatest. A more literal translation is God is greater. It's not Allah al-Akbar, it's Allahu Akbar, it's God is greater, which implies than something else. So it's something that people shout when they're facing something large and frightening. If bullets are being fired in your direction, then you shout it to give yourself, to boost your morale, to shout, God is greater than these bullets. Maybe I'm going to be killed, but God is greater than the fact of my death. So maybe in that situation, you should translate it as something like, "Come on, boys, we're not scared," you know? So it's a phrase which means different things in different contexts to different people who are articulating it. And then just a more general point, the question was about untranslatability. Well, life itself, the experience of life, is an untranslatable experience. At base, the experience of being alive is a mysterious thing. It's something which can't be expressed in language. And I was complaining earlier about bad journalism which translates, metaphorically speaking, which translates experience, and when it's bad, it does it through filters, through ideological filters. But language itself is an ideological filter. We can't open our mouths, even in our own language, even if we're moving from Arabic to Arabic or from English to English, even in one language, we can't speak without using ideology and previous assumptions and so on. So there's the problem, not just for translators, but for all writers and all speakers, is that, so I suppose works of art, are the best works of art, are only ever interesting failures to translate the ultimately mystical and untranslatable experience of being here, of being alive, whatever it means.
Let's move on. No,
I was,
let's keep going.
And yet there are so many, we're in an enormous exhibition centre full of people's compact packages of trying to translate this mysterious life and then translate other people's versions of it into other languages. And there's many things that I'm sure you all want to go out there and explore, and there's so much more we could say about this topic, but I think we only have time for one more question. So please go ahead. I think there's a mic that's going to...
Hi there. You talked a little bit before about the limitations of shoddy journalism and bad translation. Particularly with the Arab Spring, there were so many young freelancers going out there with limited language skills or maybe a crash course. Is there anything you can suggest that could improve the situation?
Well, yeah, many things. I mean, an obvious, in response to what you've just said, the assumption that people, I don't like the idea of parachute journalism. I've occasionally been asked to do it myself. I was recently, for the magazine the Critical Muslim I work for, I was sent to Pakistan to write an essay summing it all up. And I felt a bit, so I gave a very personal version, and I probably know, I used to live there, so I know it better than some people. But I can speak very, very basic Urdu. I'm not a fluent speaker of Urdu or Punjabi or any other language there apart from English, which is only spoken by certain classes. I can't go and just have a chat with the man selling the newspaper or the man in selling kebabs or whatever. So I don't feel qualified. So usually a British newspaper would not send a correspondent to Paris who can't speak good French and isn't versed in French culture. But they do tend to assume with other parts of the world, less valued parts of the world, like the Arab world, that it doesn't really matter. And of course that leads to bad journalism, because the people can only talk to an elite, educated in English, and to government officials and so on. And they're targets for propaganda, and they can't tell when they're being propagandized or when somebody has been planted. So that's an obvious thing. They should be able to speak the language. And then the other thing is listen to the local people and try to understand each situation within its own context, rather than, don't try to understand the popular revolution in Syria through the prism of the American invasion of Iraq, which is a totally different situation, for example. But people do this, and they're too lazy, and I think it's because they're not challenged enough on it. But I'm optimistic, because now that in the Arab world we have this sudden, it's not sudden, it was all going on under the surface, but this suddenly visible plethora of, or audible plethora of voices, the Arabs themselves are speaking. And if outsiders continue trying to speak on their behalf and getting it wrong, then they'll just be increasingly made to look stupid. It won't go on like this, I don't think.
Was this idea of familiarizing the unfamiliar and having to use some kind of lazy tropes to do so. And you talked about Bassem Youssef being compared to Jon Stewart. Because there's the idea that Jon Stewart is a familiar figure and people won't be able to understand that there's this Egyptian host who's very active. And Bassem Youssef is like Bassem Youssef, you know. And so within, say, the Syrian context, there's a lot of people working, there's a lot of journalists working in there, but there's an idea that their work would be too unfamiliar, and there's a laziness not just from, I would say, the journalists who have been parachuted in, but also from the media in the UK not to work directly with these people and give them a stage. And that's the translation can provide, or has a role to provide voice to these people who are already working in these extremely difficult contexts. So for Real Festivals, for example, we don't pretend to speak on behalf of Iraqi poets. We try to provide a stage for these Iraqi poets so that the voice can be out there, and that's a key element, I would say, of translation.
Samia, do you have a...
No, it's not working.
Oh, we'll have to switch mics again.
I believe that what we should have learned from, you know, the uprisings in the Arab region is the importance of, in relation to translation in particular, is the importance of working in conversation. You know, that it's not I mean, that translation is not an individual act, that you really have to do it within a group almost. And that's why, and it's not enough to know the language. I mean, even if you send them out, not with a crash course, but with a real course, you still need that conversation and a sort of shedding of identity and boundaries and borders in order to be able to actually produce that text that we all want to read, right?
I'd like to thank all of our panelists again for giving us a lot of food for thought, and I think I'm certainly going to be walking around the book fair with a very different framework in my mind as I look at books from all these different countries selling themselves and thinking about what they're selling and the motivation behind their authorship and translation. And I'd also invite you to have a look at the Pen Atlas, which is trying to provide a platform, as Firefly and the Real Festivals do, to people from around the world to speak about their own cultures and subcultures rather than providing a voice for us to speak about them. And to thank all of our panelists for their endeavors on behalf of this dynamic movements towards a more diverse and pluralist culture, not just here today, but in that outside world. So thank you again.